as 800 people, and some of the finest people of the United States patronize these places.
The trademark Lansky honesty brought in high rollers from all over the country.
And the $100 bills were that high. Oh, they were just incredible. I know one fellow by the name of Joe Milstein. 1 week, Joe Milstein lost $800,000, all in cash. Now, that's just one player. The house extracts a certain amount of every play, and as a result, their take was monumental.
Did I enjoy it? Oh, sure, it was profitable, too.
Profitable because Lansky and his partners were extracting millions in illegal earnings out of casinos protected by the New York Mafia. But as Lansky was making his mark in the tropics, a shadow was looming over the rest of the world. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany was a painful reminder for the Russian-born Jew of his family's struggle with oppression. On his trips to New York, Lansky began to sniff out rallies of Nazi sympathizers like the German-American Bund. Then he would show up with a truckload of goons and break up the rally. But his big chance to be a part of the war effort came when Navy intelligence decided to join forces with the mob to keep the New York docks clear of Nazi saboteurs. The Navy knew that the Sicilian Mafia controlled the waterfront and figured that even in prison, Meyer's pal Lucky Luciano still controlled the Sicilians. Only one man could take the Navy's request to Luciano, Meyer Lansky. "I'll help you," the little man told the Navy brass. It's patriotism. Over the next year, Lansky met with Lucky in prison a dozen times. And in fact, there was no sabotage on the waterfront. More importantly, Lansky used the meetings to solidify his connections with the Italian mob. After the war, Lansky took his second eldest son, Paul, on a cross-country drive to Las Vegas. The purpose of the trip? To keep tabs on the man Paul knew as Uncle Ben, Bugsy Siegel.
I think my grandfather knew, with the other partners involved with Ben, that he had to keep a real close visual eye on Ben to make sure that his nature, not his intelligence, but his nature didn't kind of stray. Because let's face it, he'd like to have a good time, and sometimes that gets in the way of business.
It had always been Meyer who kept Bugsy under control, and Bugsy was way out of control now. With mafia money, Siegel was trying to make Las Vegas a gambling mecca on the same scale as Florida, starting with the construction of the luxurious Flamingo Hotel. But cost overruns were draining the mafia's money. Bugsy was running the Flamingo into the ground before it even opened. Only months after Lansky's visit, Siegel was shot to death in Los Angeles.
That could not be done without Meyer Lansky being aware of it. He had to at least reluctantly nod his head.
Lansky always denied signing off on Siegel's murder. "I loved him," he was to say later, "and as long as he listened to me, he stayed out of trouble." Benny Siegel was dead. Lucky Luciano was also gone, released from prison and deported to Italy. Meyer Lansky was the last of his New York threesome left standing in America, and he had only begun his rise to the top as the mob's foremost tycoon. By the late 1940s, Meyer Lansky had consolidated his Florida gambling empire. He was making millions from the tourists who gambled at his glamorous casinos near Miami. And he was sending millions north to his partners in the New York Mafia, who provided the muscle to back him up. But there was one partner he could not manage, his wife, Anne. The couple now had 3 children, Buddy the eldest, Paul, and a daughter, Sandra. Lansky, always on the move between his Florida casinos and his New York headquarters, wasn't around much. Anne Lansky, forced to manage the family almost on her own, had not been up to the strain. Anne divorced Meyer in 1947. Soon afterwards, she was placed in a mental hospital.
She would just sit in a corner in a little room in New York City and maybe recognize you, maybe not. You know, just has no conception of time. You know, you haven't seen her for 10 years, you go knock on the door, she might tell you to leave. Come back later.
After the divorce, Meyer made a greater effort to play family man. He was especially concerned that his disabled son Buddy make new friends, so Meyer enlisted the help of a hospital volunteer who'd met Buddy during physical therapy sessions, Vincent Mercurio. Lansky himself soon took a liking to Mercurio and offered him bits of advice when the threesome went out for ball games.
"Do you gamble?" He asked me. I says, "No." He said, "And never start." He said, "Because you're always going to lose." And I trusted his judgment because, I mean, you're talking to the guy that's on the top of this, and he knew what the percentages were.
When asked by friends, Lansky would reluctantly recommend only one casino game.
Blackjack. He said, because you have a 17.5% chance of winning. He said, but the others are all sucker games.
In 1948, Lansky's games hit a snag. Americans were turning against gambling. Towns like Hallandale withdrew their support. One by one, Lansky's casinos were shut. But Lansky could ride out the crisis. He had stashed millions away. And for once, Lansky's family life seemed to be going well. His son Paul had even been accepted by West Point.
Extremely proud of that. That's like playing ball for Notre Dame to my grandfather. You know, your kid is there. Your son made it.
And in 1948, Lansky got married for the second time to a manicurist he'd met in Florida, Teddy Schwartz. But when Lansky arrived home from his honeymoon in Europe, there was unpleasant news. U.S. Senator Estes Kefauver had brought his traveling investigation of organized crime to New York. Lansky learned that Vincent Mercurio, staying with Buddy at the Lansky's New York home, had accepted Meyer's subpoena at the door.
He said, that's great. He says, did Vince open the telegram? Tell him to go for me. So I met him, and he says, you want to go down for me instead? I says, no, thank you. He says, why? I says, I don't know what to say. He just sit there and say yes and no.
Which is exactly what Lansky did. He pled the fifth. But the hearings were televised in time. Lansky's place at the center of the organized crime world was on public display. The investigation concluded for the mob tycoon with a Florida indictment for illegal gambling. Joseph Varon, who had now signed on as Lansky's personal lawyer, told his client to fight. But Lansky, afraid that he might have to testify against his friends in the mob, wanted to plead guilty.
Meyer said, look, there's a way I can get out of this by paying a $1,000 fine. So let's pay a fine. I said, Meyer, but the other boys that are going to be indicted with you, you're giving them criminal records and you're giving yourself a criminal record. What's a $1,000 fine? Pay it.
A year later, he was indicted again, this time in Saratoga Springs. Again, he avoided testifying by pleading guilty. This time, a fine wouldn't be enough. Lansky spent 3 months in the county jail. Released in August 1953, he decided it was time to take his gambling racket out of the country. He went south, all the way to Cuba, where gambling was legal and mobsters were welcome. And in 1953, Cuba needed Lansky just as much as he needed a safe haven. Lansky had been dabbling in Cuban gambling for years, but now the Havana tourist industry was threatened by scandal. Many of the casinos were exposed as using doctored games to cheat tourists. To restore international faith in the Cuban casinos, President Fulgencio Batista turned to the one man whose reputation for running a fair game was impeccable, Meyer Lansky, and offered him a job as gambling czar. The little man took the job with gusto and told the other casino operators, clean up or get out. With Lansky at the helm, Cuban tourism exploded. Lansky invited his mafia pals to invest, and many did.
The Americans were pouring in there, other nationalities were pouring in there. Meyer made a fortune.
Lansky made sure he stayed in the good graces of President Batista.
I know that every time Meyer went to Cuba, he would bring a briefcase with at least $100,000. So Batista welcomed him with open arms. And the two men had such an affection for each other. Batista really loved them. I know because he brought, I guess I'd love him too. He gave me $100,000 every time he saw me.
Lansky rented a third home in Havana. He ran one major casino of his own, the Nacional. There he resumed his traditional role, the quiet commander, pacing the casino floor and watching the dollars roll in.
And you could almost get the sense of people turning and looking and knowing who he was and not saying anything to him, but sort of like the Red Seas party. People don't have to tell you, you just, you know, who's who. And he was somebody.
At the Nacional, Lansky was fussed over by the staff, including waiter Jorge Fernandez, and constantly protected by a team of bodyguards.
They would be reading the Havana Post, a newspaper printed here in Cuba. But across their laps they had a little Smith & Wesson, a little revolver you could not see.
Los dos en la misma posición. Muerto así, cuando entraba, así mirando.
It was in case someone should make an attempt on the life of Meyer Lansky. That was who they were protecting.
Lansky, que era el que estaban cuidando.
Cuba looked like a sure thing, so in 1956, the man who warned his own friends not to gamble placed his biggest wager yet.
He pulled all this money together to actually invest further, reinvest, like the good businessman, in this wonderful hotel, the Riviera, which was in its day and remains the best hotel in Cuba, the most comfortable, the first one with central air conditioning instead of all those little boxes in the windows dripping water down.
Lansky began spending more of his time in Cuba, away from the grip of American investigators. But even the mafia tycoon couldn't stay out of the law's clutches forever. In October 1957, New York mob boss Albert Anastasia was murdered in a Manhattan barbershop. New York police knew that before his death, Anastasia had been looking to invest in Cuban casinos, so they wanted to question Meyer Lansky. Learning that Lansky was making a short trip to New York, the police pounced. Lansky was arrested and questioned about Anastasia. He denied any knowledge of the murder.
I couldn't tell him anything. I know nothing about it. But it was just as foreign to me as it would be to an Eskimo in Alaska.
As an excuse for questioning Lansky, the police charged him with vagrancy, a technicality that the millionaire found especially offensive.
Do you pay taxes in the United States?
Oh, yes. Very dearly. But I'm a vagrant.
The police put a tail on Lansky. Detective William Graff settled down in the lobby of Lansky's hotel. Within minutes, Lansky approached the cop. He said he wanted to confess to a problem.
I know he was playing with me. No two ways about it. And finally said, I can't get good chickens in Cuba. I said, what? Good chickens in Cuba? And then he explained that he had a problem getting chickens to feed his guests at the hotel.
The poultry shortage did not stop the Riviera Hotel from being a huge success. Lansky's gamble was paying off.
He spared no expense, because here he was, legitimate, and could see this whole world of Caribbean tourism expanding. What he didn't reckon on were the guys with beards in the hills.
For 3 years, Fidel Castro and his ragged army of revolutionaries had been running raids on Batista's military from their hideouts in the mountains. On New Year's Eve 1958, just 1 year after the Riviera opened, Castro's forces took control of Cuba's major cities. Batista fled. The next day, Castro entered Havana. Rebel troops took over the casinos, including the Riviera.
In January, when my wife and I went there to the Riviera Hotel, there were Castro's men sleeping in the hallways, making barracks out of it. These filthy soldiers with their beards, and it's just pathetic. And I think that hastened Meyer's illness, because he had a heart condition and a stomach condition.
A year after the revolution, Castro banned gambling and declared the casino hotels the property of the government. Once again, Lansky was out of business. He had sunk almost his entire fortune into the Riviera Hotel, only to have it taken away gangster style at gunpoint. Now, the mob tycoon was going to have to find a new way to make his millions back. After Fidel Castro took over Cuba and evicted the American gangsters from their casinos, Meyer Lansky was at the lowest point of his career. Gone were the millions he had invested in the Havana Riviera Hotel. While he was delighted by the arrival of his first grandchild, respectfully named Meyer II by Lansky's son Paul, his health was deteriorating. In 1962, he suffered a serious heart attack. Worse, Lansky had now become a target in a clandestine FBI operation. Unauthorized